Hello, everyone. I am Adina Olario, Medical Education Fellow here at Great Ormond Street Hospital, and I'd like to welcome you all to our virtual Grand Round. Whilst we're waiting for more people to attend, I think we have around 33 participants at the moment. We'll go through a few housekeeping things. We will greatly appreciate your feedback. A Survey Monkey link will be posted in the chat box at the end of this presentation. Following submission of your feedback, you can ask for a certificate for you, which is accredited with one CPD by the Royal College. Just to be aware that the video recordings of all the Grand Round presentations are on intranet on the Gold platform. They can also be viewed on Gosh Learning Academy YouTube channel. They take, however, a little bit of time to be edited before being uploaded on the website, so please bear with us. We're going to hear today a very interesting talk about something that increasingly concerns many of us, climate change and its impact on our health. I'm having the greatest pleasure of welcoming today our speakers and our panelists. So our speaker is Dr. Hayley Pinton, and our panelists are Dr. Mark Hayden, Magali Thompson, and Nick Martin, apologize. I will let each one of them to introduce themselves.
Hi, so my name is Mark Hayden. Some of you will know me. I'm not presenting, you'll be pleased to hear. I know it said it on the flyer, but that was just to put people off. Hayley's going to be presenting, but I will be around to curate your Slido questions. And if you want to start putting them in now, then you can all vote for them. And so we can have the top voted ones at the end if you have any, or ask questions as you go along in the Slido. But I'll be around at the end to help with questions and answer any questions. And I'm always around the hospital on the rare occasion that I come to work, and you're welcome to approach me anytime.
Hi, my name's Magali Thompson. I'm the Public Realm Project Manager at Great Ormond Street, working on a vision and brief for a more sustainable and child-friendly streets surrounding the hospital.
Hi everyone, I'm Nick Martin, the Head of Sustainability, and if you have questions relating back to the hospital and what we're doing, you can ask us at the end.
Hi, my name's Hayley Pinton. Thank you so much for coming today. I'm an addiction psychiatrist and lead clinician for the Norfolk-wide Drug and Alcohol Service. I've worked in the NHS and publicly funded services for about 25 years. I'm also a speaker for Greenpeace, and which is the hat that I have on today. And I'm also a member of Psych Declares, Doctors for XR. And I want to talk to you today about climate change.
Can I just interrupt? Did we forget Days?
We did. I was waiting for Days to introduce herself.
Don't worry, you start. I'll introduce myself when it gets to my turn.
That's a classic oldies maneuver. Anyway, keep going.
Okay. So I want to talk to you today about climate change, the impact specifically on children, and what you can do about it. So our climate is changing. The science is clear that this is due to greenhouse gases. And despite the pandemic and global lockdown, greenhouse gases have continued to rise. We've heated up the Earth by just over 1 degree Celsius, which doesn't sound much, but already extreme weather events have become commonplace. Al Gore described watching the news these days as like a nature hike through the Book of Revelations. Wildfires, storms, floods, droughts, landslides. The frequency of what the insurance companies call natural catastrophe losses has more than tripled in the last 40 years. In 2016, when world leaders signed the Paris Agreement, they pledged to endeavour to keep global heating to 1.5 degrees. There was lots of political backslapping and talk of having saved the world. They tasked the IPCC to produce a report looking at what the difference might be between 1.5 and 2 degrees of heating. The report, published in 2018, showed that every fraction of a degree matters. At 1.5 degrees, we lose 70 to 90% of the coral reefs. At 2 degrees, we lose all of them. Going from 1.5 to 2 degrees doubles the number of people without access to clean water, doubles the reduction in corn production in the tropics. They also estimated how much more carbon we could put in the atmosphere to limit heating to 1.5 degrees. Based on that science, the 2050 net zero target that our government and other governments have signed up to and are describing as ambitious actually gives us only a 50% chance of staying below 1.5 degrees. Taking a 50-50 risk with the habitability of the only planet available to us is not ambitious. It's catastrophically reckless. And what's worse is this is all fairyland anyway, because emissions have continued to rise, not fall, in the years since the agreement was signed. And if you add up the pledges governments made in the Paris Agreement, the world would heat up not by 1.5, but by 3 to 4 degrees by the end of this century. The end of this century might sound like a long time away, but it's within the potential lifespan of children born today. So what would a 4-degree world look like? Well, it was described by Kevin Anderson, then head of the UK's Climate Research Institute, as incompatible with an organised global community, beyond adaptation and devastating to the majority of ecosystems. Looking at projected availability of fresh water and ability to grow crops, Johan Rockström, director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Research, said of 4 degrees, it's difficult to see how we could accommodate 1 billion people, or even half of that. There are currently close to 8 billion people on the planet. Put bluntly, what these scientists are saying is that raising temperatures to 4 degrees would result in a significant cull of humanity. And children born today could expect to live to see this start to play out if we do not act immediately. The little boy you can see at the bottom left of this slide is one of those children, my nephew's son, Reef, the first child in the next generation of my family. By the time he's my age, it's most likely that the natural wonder he is named for will be a memory. I have 3 children of my own, young adults now. For me, when people talk about climate change being an existential threat, it's not extinction per se that worries me. It's what the road to that looks like, what suffering these kids will endure and witness as adults. And as a parent, thinking of their future in that way is gut-wrenching. I've no idea how to prepare my children for this future. At the very least, I saw myself being a grandma in my retirement. But recently, my eldest daughter, like many others in her generation, is talking about not having kids because she doesn't see a safe future for them. How badly have we failed them when they can't feel safe enough to allow themselves one of the most basic human instincts, one of the greatest joys in life, to raise a family? Too many people still think that tackling the climate and ecological emergencies is about protecting wildlife. It is, and we should do that because we've no right to destroy the beauty we inherited. But it is also crucially about our health. Our lives depend on healthy ecosystems. Our most basic needs are to breathe, to have access to fresh water and food. And all of these things are now under threat. The Lancet Commission on Human Health and Climate Change 2015 report remains the only time that I've seen the word catastrophic written in a medical journal. We just don't normally use language like that. So how does climate change threaten our health? These are the headlines in terms of impacts: heat stroke, impacts of extreme weather events, air pollution, increase in vector and waterborne diseases and pandemics, reduced access to food and fresh water, driving conflict and migration. So far, children under the age of 5 are bearing the brunt of the impact, both in developing and developed nations. So why are children more vulnerable? Well, firstly, they're smaller. This makes it harder for them to regulate their body temperature in heat waves, but also when subjected to cold floodwaters. They need more calories and nutrients per kilogram of body weight, so they're more at risk in periods of famine. And when there are toxins in the air, water, or food, they again absorb more per unit of weight. This is true for air pollution. Bear in mind that 90% of the global population breathe air which exceeds WHO safe limits for pollution. And also for food and water contaminated with industrial waste during wildfires, floods, and storms. Because they're still growing, impacts can distort development, causing long-term harm, many years after the event itself. This is true for physical growth, particularly in utero, but also later in childhood. And it's also true of psychological development. Adverse childhood events impact brain development and affect how the brain responds to stress long term. This is particularly true of circumstances which disrupt attachment, impacting the child's sense of self, their confidence, ability to be independent, trust in others, and ability to form healthy relationships. I want to focus briefly on the 4 conditions jointly responsible for over 50% of global childhood deaths: lower respiratory tract infections, diarrhea, malaria, and malnutrition. All are sensitive to climate change. Warmer weather increases not only the geographical range in which vectors can thrive, but also extends the period of risk during the year. Warmer weather increases flying and biting by mosquitoes and the infectivity and replication rate of the parasite. Children experience higher complication and mortality rates from malaria and dengue fever, the prevalence of which is increasing rapidly. In the UK, our major vector-borne disease is Lyme disease. Reported cases are rising rapidly due to warmer winters. Diarrheal disease is increased after flooding when water supplies can be contaminated with sewage. Drought also reduces access to clean water. Warmer water in coastal regions and lakes increase the number of days in geographical regions suitable for growth of Vibrio cholera. Air pollution increases the incidence of asthma and chest infections. In the developing world, much of this is due to the use of solid fuel and kerosene cook stoves and lanterns. Globally, over 7 million people die early every year due to air pollution. In the UK, over 40,000 deaths per year, roughly 110 per day. Many of them are children. Little Ellie Kissadebra died aged 9 after a life marred by asthma, especially on days when air pollution peaked. After a sustained campaign by her family, she's the first individual in the UK to have air pollution specifically mentioned as a cause of death. The mortality rate is only the tip of the iceberg of the numbers suffering chronic ill health. Heat waves, wildfires further raise pollution levels. Flooding worsens respiratory health due to damp living conditions. Children in Tower Hamlets have 10% reduced lung function compared to the national average, and we've not yet looked at what this is doing to their brains. Fine particulate matter in air pollution crosses the blood-brain barrier and has been associated with impacts on cognitive performance and brain development. Several studies show an association with increased incidence of neurodevelopmental disorders such as autism. This raises issues of social and intergenerational justice. Globally, those living in the most polluted areas are usually poorer, with lower carbon footprints. Their contribution to the problem is low, but they're suffering the worst impacts. Often from ethnic minorities, they already experience disadvantage due to their social and financial status, ethnicity, poor housing and diets, lack of access to education and green spaces to exercise. Air pollution now adds to this litany poorer respiratory health and impaired brain development. Malnutrition. Over 800 million people are already undernourished. Increased heat, changing rainfall patterns, bringing drought, floods, storms, are already impacting crop growth, as evidenced in these graphs. The last time the world was 1 degree warmer, the American Midwest, the breadbasket of the USA, was a desert. This area, in common with large areas of China, India, Africa, and Australia, are already experiencing mega drought. The risk of widespread crop failure is looming. Children are more vulnerable during famine. I've spoken to doctors who describe the emotional toll of trying to treat children with acute malnutrition. The mortality rate is high. We know there are long-term physical impacts on growth and development, but there is also an increasing body of research indicating that there are long-term mental health impacts as well, such as this study looking at survivors of the Great Famine in China. Extreme weather events have obvious risks of injury and death. What's less often considered are the long-term mental health impacts. Storms, floods, wildfires bring experience of trauma and loss of family members, friends, pets, homes, disruption of community networks and extended family, sometimes loss of an entire way of life, disruption of transport and communication networks, and damage to infrastructure also disrupt access to treatment for acute and chronic conditions. Whilst up to 60% of adults experience PTSD or depression after severe events, the figure in children is higher, up to 90%. Even in the UK, studies looking at communities affected by flooding highlight the loss of a sense of safety in the home, and teachers report entire classrooms of children unable to concentrate the moment it starts to rain. In poorer countries, when drought or other extreme weather such as coastal storms and flooding impacts communities, most losses are uninsured. People simply lose everything. They must start again from scratch or leave. As stress on families increases, it's usually girls who are taken out of education to help at home, or because the family can no longer afford school fees or equipment. They have to spend more time and energy walking to fetch water, and whilst they're out, they're vulnerable. A recent survey showed that the primary concern of adolescent girls in the Sudan was gender-based violence, and around a quarter had considered suicide. In Bangladesh, women report that they lack the education to understand the way flood warnings are worded, and when floods hit, they are often the ones at home trying to save the children, often not having been taught to swim and are hampered by their clothing. In these poorer parts of the world, approximately 60 to 80% of food is grown by women smallholders. They lack land rights, access to credit, and access to education, which could help them find ways to change their farming methods to adapt to a changing climate. They also often lack the access to contraception and personal power to control their fertility, so they have more hungry mouths to feed with their dwindling crop yields. Without access to cash from sale of surplus, they can't afford healthcare. In some cultures, as the situation worsens, the pressure on families can lead to increased rates of forced underage marriage. This is the reality for much of the global south already. Many of these problems are not new, but climate change is exacerbating already precarious situations. 53% of disaster-related deaths occur in 11% of developing nations. They are all non-white populations. Is this part of why we're not responding? Even in developed nations, poverty interacts with race to increase risk. During Hurricane Katrina in Orleans Parish, the mortality rate among blacks was 1.7 to 4 times higher than that among whites. In an increasing number of areas of the world, particularly around the tropics, from Central America to Sub-Saharan Africa to the Middle East to South Asia, drought, storms and heat are triggering regional and local conflict and driving people away from their homes and their ancestral way of life. The UN predicts up to 1 million climate refugees by the middle of the century. Sorry, up to 1 billion climate refugees by 2050, only 30 years away. The Pentagon refers to climate change as a threat multiplier. The Syrian war was preceded by 4 years of record drought, which drove 1 million farmers off their land and into the cities, helping to trigger a conflict which has driven a further 5 million people out of Syria altogether and traumatized an entire population, particularly the children. A Syrian doctor recently described the trauma experienced by children there as beyond anything even soldiers have endured. He coined a new term for this, human devastation syndrome. Globally, 28 million people per year are already being driven from their homes by extreme weather. For migrants, one loss event piles on top of another. Loss of home and a sense of safety, loss of friends and community, loss of culture, ancestral way of life, often compounded by trauma, bereavement, and for children, potential separation from caregivers, leaving them vulnerable to traffickers or simply to neglect and starvation. What we are seeing as immigration increases is the rise of toxic ideologies that seek to other these people, that puts up walls and fences and tightens immigration laws. This is the armoured lifeboat approach. It will not save us in the end. As the High and Dry report published by the World Bank states, in a globalised and connected world, such problems are impossible to quarantine. And in the meantime, watching those who have barely contributed to a problem created by our lifestyle die on the other side of those walls robs us of our humanity. So if we don't act now, what sort of world will our children grow up to live in? One poisoned by pollution, battered by extreme weather, with water and food shortages driving economic collapse, conflict and mass migration. If you're feeling like this by now, that's rational. If I'm honest, this is me sometimes. Many people, including children, are starting to experience what has been called eco-anxiety or eco-distress. A related state is the term solastalgia, the pain of witnessing environmental degradation of the area you call home. And this can range from watching the woods you played in as a child leveled to build a retail park, to indigenous tribes watching the forests they've called home for hundreds of years burned to make space for a cattle ranch or palm oil plantation. A recent survey by the Royal College demonstrated that over half of child psychiatrists are seeing eco-distress in the young people they work with. Whilst fear and grief are often talked about, what is less acknowledged but usually present is rage. We have a right to be angry. What's really important to understand about eco-distress is that this is not a disorder. Fear, rage, grief are part of our natural emotional range. They're there to warn us when something's not right and motivate us to do something about it. In the words of Graham Lawton, staff writer for The New Scientist, if eco-anxiety is treated as a pathology, then the forces of denial will have won. What we're witnessing isn't a tsunami of mental illness, but a long overdue outbreak of sanity. The usual platitudes just don't work for this, and unlike many of the crises we experience, bereavement, failure, time will not make this better. Decisive global action to reduce CO2 emissions is the appropriate treatment for eco-anxiety, not medication or interventions to eradicate the discomfort. That's not to say that the emotional response to this cannot exacerbate existing or underlying mental health conditions, just as normal grief after bereavement can trigger a long-lasting depression. It's important to look out for that. Also, some individuals can become overly fixated on the carbon footprint of every action they take, overestimating the global impact of this. And this can be paralyzing. It becomes impossible to take a car journey, much less a flight, without severe distress or guilt. How do we respond to this? Well, one approach is the healthy dose of realism. Overestimation of individual impact is actively fueled by fossil fuel companies that seek to shirk their corporate responsibility by fostering a sense that we can solve this if everyone just made the right personal choices. This is a barefaced lie. In the early 2000s, BP was the first company to promote a personal carbon footprint calculator as part of its Beyond Petroleum campaign, along with redesigning its logo to look greener. You can see at the bottom left of this slide some of the responses to a competition Greenpeace ran to redesign their rebranded logo. Despite talk of going on a low carbon diet, advertising campaigns with images of wind farms and solar panels, I'm sure you've all seen them on the underground. The reality is that nearly 20 years later, BP still only invests a paltry 2.3% of its budget in renewable energy. And BP isn't the only one at it. Shell tried a similar approach on Twitter recently and got such an entertaining tranche of responses they had to take it down. They asked the question, what are you willing to change to help reduce emissions? Professor Catherine Hayhoe, what am I willing to do? Hold you accountable for 2% of cumulative greenhouse gas emissions, equivalent to those of my entire home country of Canada. When you have a concrete plan to address that, I'd be happy to talk about what I'm doing to reduce my personal emissions. The wonderful Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. I'm willing to hold you accountable for lying about the climate crisis for 30 years, when you secretly knew that fossil fuel emissions would destroy our planet. And my personal favourite, Billy Weir, environment consultant for CNN, this is like Freddy Krueger asking what you're willing to change to get better sleep. The reality is that the infrastructure of our society is fossil fuel dependent, and living any other way is all but impossible. Focusing on individual behaviour plays into the hands of governments and corporations that don't want to change. So stop feeling guilty about not being perfect. Nobody has to be perfect to join this movement. That thinking is a way of silencing us. Take a look at this extract. You might be forgiven for thinking this was written recently by Al Gore, talking about potentially catastrophic events, countries having their agricultural output reduced or destroyed, and that once the effects are measurable, they might not be reversible. But it wasn't Al Gore. This was James F. Black, ExxonMobil senior scientist in the 1970s. How right they were. Since then, has ExxonMobil changed its business model and invested its resources in developing sustainable technology? No, they've maintained a concerted disinformation campaign and lobbied to block policies to curb emissions. If all of that leaves you feeling any of the rage I mentioned earlier, that's not an illness. So how can we be helpful to children experiencing eco-distress? Greenpeace has some freely available resource sheets to help address this with younger children. The Climate Psychology Alliance also has an amazing website with a host of resources, information and training. Firstly, don't dismiss these kids and their feelings. Listen and validate. Allow them to express their distress and let them know you take it seriously. Help them to build their resilience. Link them into groups of others who are experiencing the same concerns. Being with others who get it combats the sense of isolation and hopelessness. Encourage them to reconnect with nature. This can be regenerative and has demonstrated significant benefits for mental and physical well-being. And talk about what you can do together to make a difference. Hope and empowerment are the greatest antidotes to helplessness and fear. When we give our children these, we shift the focus away from an overwhelming sense of danger and towards a capacity for meaningful action. Anxiety, grief, rage, give them the energy. We give them the hope and direction, and they start to realize that they can be an important, powerful part of the solution. And that's why it's so important for their future and for their mental health that our young people are able to protest safely, But our rights to protest are being steadily eroded, and young people are being affected. Recently, a 16-year-old in foster care was visited by the police and threatened with a £10,000 fine for advertising a protest about the new police crime sentencing and court bill with her friends. One of the young activists in the HS2 tunnel was effectively assaulted by private security guards who were trying to pull her out, although she was locked on, in the process pulling up her top and exposing her breast. How does this impact our children's sense of safety, of inclusion in and having a voice in our society? The police crime sentencing and court bill basically criminalises anything but quiet, unobtrusive protest. That's not a form of protest that will change anything. At a time more than any other when we need to hold our government to account, we must oppose this kind of legislation. I want to pause now and hand over to Days Agaji, an amazing young woman who's been an activist since her mid-teens and now works with other children involved in the movement.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that was sombering for everyone. And yeah, it kind of reminds me of why I'm here and why I'm doing this. So I would like to tell you about my own story, but also the story of the kids that I work with. So I think the only way you can really understand how I got to climate change is by understanding where I came from. So I grew up in North London, in Tottenham, and I was born into poverty. I lived in a 1-bedroom flat with my mum, my 2 brothers, and my dad, and that was our existence. And around the age of 8 or so, my mum, she started her restaurant, and this lifted us out of poverty. And I was able to go to boarding school. And when I went to boarding school, I basically connected to nature. This was the first time I'd left the city, let alone really understood like what a cow does, or like, you know, how green everything is outside of a place like Tottenham. And I ended up falling in love with nature. I worked on our allotment next to the boarding house, or where we learned how to grow, where we learned how to nourish the earth, and in turn how it nourishes us. And this was a real awakening to my connection with nature. But around 16, I decided to move back to North London to live at home. And this is when I started getting very ill very quickly. I always remembered not being able to breathe whenever I was in London when I was younger, but I didn't realize that this wasn't just the way that we're meant to be, but this was a sign of quite severe asthma that I redeveloped when I was 16 years old, and also with some skin issues as well. And I remember at this time, I was really confused of what was happening. I kept going to the doctors, and the doctors kept telling me that nothing's wrong. It's all hormones. You'll get over it. You're just adjusting. But I didn't realize that it was because it was the smog that burned over my house, because I live very close to an incinerator. And this was when I decided to do my own research, as every 16-year-old would. And I went on Google and I started looking into it. And this is when I found out about air pollution in London specifically, and air pollution in my city. And the realization that air pollution was a thing, air pollution was something that affected all of our health, and also the fact that we all grew up there not knowing anything was different, not knowing that this was wrong, was part of my anger. And this is when I got very angry. And in turn, I actually ended up learning about, stumbling over to the information that I found out about the climate crisis, and how this isn't just an air pollution issue, but the whole world as I saw it was falling apart in front of me. And I went into many years of inaction because I was so scared. I didn't know what to do. And I was kind of tired of people saying one meatless Monday is going to be the solution to everything, when I knew that we were far past this point. And this is when I decided to go to university and kind of continued having this climate anxiety about everything that was happening, but feeling utterly powerless to do anything. But then I remember one Wednesday evening, my friend, she came and took me out, and she told me that we are going to a meeting. And at this time I was suffering with depression and meningitis. So I had nothing else to be doing. And she got me out of my room and she took me to a meeting. And this was the first time I ever engaged with Extinction Rebellion. This was the beginning of 2019. And little did I know at that time, that year was going to be the year that changed my life. I went to that meeting, and me and my friend, we stood outside for ages, talking ourselves out of going so we can go to the pub instead, because our anxiety was through the roof. But then someone came out and she asked us whether we wanted a cup of tea and whether we wanted to come upstairs. And through her act of kindness, it changed my life. Going into that meeting, it didn't just show me what I'd always needed to hear, that this is serious and this is a crisis, and it preached the urgency that I needed, but also it gave a place that I could actually process the grief that I was feeling about the climate. When I was in boarding, I actually was in boarding in Skegness, which is a small seaside town for most people who didn't know. And I was finding out information that by 2030, most of Skegness will no longer exist. Flooding will force people out of their homes and to have to leave. And this was the information that I was finding out at this time. And I did not know how to process this. I did not know how to hold it. But in a place like Extinction Rebellion, I found community, and I found someone saying, I'm here to hold you within your grief. And when I had the moment of being held and feeling like I can open up and feeling like I can process what's happening, I launched into action. And this was when we started planning towards the 2019 April Rebellion. And I obviously did not know what I was doing. At this time, I was 18 years old. I was very, full of energy, but also kind of just figuring things out as we went along. And after the rebellion went so well, I ended up running for election as well. And I think this was the moment for me of where everything did really change, because it wasn't just feeling like I have the agency, but also finding the education to do so. And this is when I learned about things like international solidarity and how we can start helping the global south to deal with this issue that we created, and having this moral responsibility to do more. And even through this process, I ended up connecting back to my Indigenous roots in the Niger Delta. I'd always known about the floodings that affected my Indigenous area. My grandma still lives there. And I remember the economic struggles of when the Shell oil spill happened, and having to rehome my grandma and having to rehome my family. But I did not know at this time that this was the story of climate change. So through this and going through the election and finding out the education, I felt empowered to be able to help others as well. And this is when I started working directly with young people. At this time, I was a substitute primary school teacher, and I started to bring what I was learning to my pupils. And they wowed me with their ideas about how we can get out of this. And this is when I really started to acknowledge that it's not just young people, teenagers who have agency, it's children too. And this is where we need to start learning and really thinking about the ways that we interact with one another. And through this journey, I was able to figure out how they feel within this. And although there was so much energy and need for action and feeling like things can change, there was also a lot of sadness that I came through too. I remember quite vividly a 15-year-old kid in a sharing circle said how she is mourning the loss of a child that she never knew that she could have. And the pain that comes from understanding that this isn't only them, but this is me too. I have also wondered whether I can have kids. I have also wondered how my life could be. I remember growing up wanting to be a historian, and now I sit at the end of my 3-year degree knowing that this is no longer reality for me, because I cannot sit away when I know that the climate crisis is happening, and I cannot be a historian. I cannot do what I feel like I want to do, because I need to fight for the climate so the future generations don't have to bear the brunt that I'm currently doing now. But through this, I've also been empowered by this generation, not just my own, but young ones who are coming up, because we are resilient. We have lived through economic crisis, we've lived through political distress, and we have lived through the climate change, and we continue to do so. But you see the fire that burns in all young people, creating change right now and asking for better and holding governments accountable. And through this, I feel that since we are taking on the brunt, elders should too. There is something quite beautiful about Indigenous cultures, of where they see it as not just elders teaching young people, but elders working with young people. And this is, especially as I become older and older in this journey that I'm taking, I want to figure out how I can serve young people to be able to have agency over what's happening. And this is where I feel that people like yourself should come in. You guys should be the elders that hold us within our grief, but also acknowledge the agency that we bear, acknowledge that we can do something, and help us learn how to do that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jace. That was incredible. I just want to say, so what is our government doing about all of this? Later this year, the UK will host the COP26, the crucial meeting of world leaders at which we need them to improve on the inadequate pledges that they made in the Paris Agreement, the ones that would give us a 4-degree world. So what sort of example and leadership are we showing in the run up to this? Well, our government can't even make the decision not to go ahead with a new coal mine, and are handing out new licenses for oil and gas drilling. They've pledged 12 billion for green recovery, but 27 billion for new roads. The short-lived green home strategy was utterly inadequate to upgrade our outdated buildings in which our poorest citizens live in cold, damp, drafty conditions. And we continue to build new homes on floodplains that will later have to be retrofitted. The government have no plausible plan for achieving their net zero claims. And on top of this, they're threatening to slash foreign aid. The developing world needs to lift their people out of poverty. We have to support them to do this by leapfrogging to clean new technology. If we don't, they will use fossil fuels because they're cheaper. A litre of oil is cheaper than a litre of Coke. If we can't consider helping them a moral imperative, then we should think of it as self-preservation, because if they develop using fossil fuels, we all fry. People want a silver bullet, but the reality for climate change is it's more like silver buckshot. We need to change everything. That sounds daunting, but there are solutions ready to be implemented. If you're looking for hope, I recommend the Drawdown Project. They researched around 100 solutions, figured out how much they could reasonably be scaled up by mid-century, how much it would cost, and how much it would save. Most of these solutions require, yes, sometimes substantial initial investment, but then in the longer term save money. Adding up the impact, they stated we could achieve not just net zero, but be starting to pull carbon out of the atmosphere by 2050. And what's really great about it is that most of these solutions are win-win. They create jobs, they have health and social gains built in. For example, Drawdown's 6th and 7th most impactful solutions are educating girls and improving access to family planning. This is not just a climate solution, it's an issue of justice, choice, and dignity. Modern economists are looking at this as well. Kate Raworth took the Potsdam Climate Institute's concept of planetary boundaries and added social boundaries to make the donut, an economic system that works within the physical boundaries of a sustainable world whilst also ensuring social justice, access to healthcare, education, equality, and political voice. The LEAP project in Canada pulled together campaigners from all areas of social and environmental justice, including Indigenous peoples, and looked at how these issues interconnect. They pulled together a manifesto that addressed all these issues together. If we take this example and stop playing my cause is more important than yours top trumps, and work together for a world where we respect not just each other, but also the natural systems that support us, then we have enough people, enough commitment and fire to force the change we need to make a world that is better for everyone and healthier for everyone. The health co-benefits of a sustainable society are huge, combating much of the chronic disease we spend so much time, resources and suffering on, including benefit for mental well-being. The Lancet report that talked about potentially catastrophic impacts for health also said that acting on climate change could be the biggest public health opportunity of the century. So what to do next? Firstly, embrace the magnitude of the problem and get involved. Don't be a bystander. As Albert Einstein said, the world will not be destroyed by those who do evil, but by those who watch them without doing anything. And you can work on 3 levels: personal, organizational, and political. I've made the point that lifestyle change won't fix this alone. That doesn't mean you shouldn't make what changes you can. Social contagion is an important part of changing society. So make changes and let people know you've done it. Visible change spreads faster. The most impactful things you can do: where you can, walk, cycle, use public transport, minimize car use and flying, reduce energy use by insulating your home, switch to a green energy company. They're generally not more expensive and your bills will help fund new sustainable energy projects. Diet. You don't need to be a fundamentalist vegan, but a more plant-based diet, reducing your meat, especially red meat and dairy intake, cutting down food waste and eating more locally and seasonally makes a difference. And look at your consumer habits. How much stuff do you really need? Start looking at every purchase through the need or want filter. And if you want to change, try selling stuff on or buying from secondhand shops and websites like Depop, Recycle. Be part of a circular economy. If you have savings or investments, take them out of banks which invest in fossil fuels like Barclays and move to ethical banks like Triodos or Nationwide. And work within your organisation. Gosh is the first hospital in London to declare a climate emergency. So great job, guys. It's amazing. Be part of what comes next. Speak to Nick Martin about becoming a climate emergency responder or a green champion. Without doubt, then the most important way you can make a difference is through collective action. The easiest way to do this is through petitions. You'll find a host of these on the Greenpeace website, and it only takes a few minutes to sign them all. But also badger your elected representatives by email, on Twitter, book an appointment to speak to them. Don't be fobbed off with platitudes and lies. And be brave. Get out on the streets and insist on change. As health professionals, we can have a huge impact. Doctors and nurses are trusted voices, and we have a recognised role as advocates for public health. You guys work for Great Ormond Street. It's a famous brand. Use it. I was in London with Extinction Rebellion during the October protest in 2019, and I saw the impact it had on crowds to see groups of doctors and nurses pitch up to talk about the health impacts of climate change. It helped to validate the protest and challenge the perception of protesters as ignorant crusties. During that protest, Dr. Richard Horton, chief editor of The Lancet, went on record to say, "The duties of a doctor are first and foremost to an individual patient and the public that they serve. Doctors and all health professionals have a responsibility and obligation to engage in all kinds of non-violent social protests to address the climate emergency. That is the duty of a doctor." If you want to get involved, there are many organisations you can contribute to. Some are on this slide. The bottom line is this. The 2020s are the most important decade humanity has ever faced. In the next 10 years, we will choose our future. Christiana Figueres, who was instrumental in negotiating the Paris Agreement, said hope is not soft. Hope is the axe you break the door down with in an emergency. And failure is unthinkable. For Reef, for all the children that we love, while there is still hope, why wouldn't we throw everything at it? Thank you for listening. Any questions for me or Days? I'll stop sharing my screen now.
Thanks, Hayley.
Thank you very much.
So, Hayley and Days, I just want to say that was fantastic. I rarely listen to a talk. And if I do, I rarely listen to all of it. And I listen to every word you said then. And I learned a lot. I'm going to ask some of the questions on Slido. And we've got a great panel. I think you guys are going to be able to answer them. I'm not going to necessarily answer them in the order that they've been voted up. And that's because the top question is for Nick and Magali. And Nick and Magali are going to be around for a while. They're going to be around after this session. And the question is, how is GOSH involved in this battle? And I think really that's a question of, is GOSH just greenwashing? Or is GOSH going to actually take serious action about this and have internal actions and change? So I'm going to let you guys think about that question, but I'm going to ask some questions to Days and Hayley first, with your permission. So the first question I'm going to ask you, Days. I'm going to try and combine two of the questions together. One of the questions is about what can health professionals do? What's the most impactful thing they can do? And the other question is, how can we help the youth? And for our purposes, you're going to represent the youth for today. I can't remember it, but others may. How can we help the youth when they are disenfranchised and ignored by the ruling or worldwide political classes? So, can I turn that question into how can health professionals help the youth? How can we lift up your voices?
Yeah, I feel like health professionals are very important in the fight for climate. To recognize climate change as a health issue. I think it's really important because my whole life has been affected by my health issues that I didn't know for a very long time were connected to climate change. So I think that is particularly important, especially when it comes to psychology. I remember the first time I tried to explain my anxiety around the environment to a therapist. And this was like pre, the real big environmental push. And she basically told me that I didn't know what I was talking about. And if it was that hard, just totally leave activism, just get away from it. And she didn't understand that the one thing that was saving me through my anxiety was the activism I was doing. And I think it is understanding how we need to be held and also need to be given the space to express the grief of many things, of our, connection to nature, of the parts of nature that we will be missing, like, the seaside that I talk about in Skegness, but also the grief of the futures that we had planned to have. And I think that's really important in having the space to be able to mourn that, but also acknowledging that we have agency and making sure that we feel like we have agency. A lot of the time with young people, our agency is stripped away from us. Or we're told that we don't know enough. We're told that we're too young. We're told we should focus on other things. But if we've decided to put ourselves in this space, what we need is support rather than, adults telling us what to do. So I think that's basically how healthcare professionals can really help us in the fight for young people and the fight for climate as well.
Thank you. Beautiful answer. I'm going to go to probably Hayley next, but if Daisy you want to answer this, that is cool. How much worse is eco-anxiety being made by what's perhaps a common attitude in the sort of current adult population that the children will save us? And are we doing that and just making it somebody else's problem, pushing the problem onto either the youth or, I guess, in a similar way, pushing the problem from the global north to the global south?
So, I mean, the first thing I would say is it breaks my heart to see children on the streets about this. They should not be the ones being asked to take responsibility, and I completely appreciate why they would feel very angry about that attitude. I absolutely agree with what Daisy is saying, that they do have agency. They have a very powerful, authoritative voice because it's their world that we're talking about. And we need to allow them to express that. But we can't just dump the responsibility for this on them. By the time a 14-year-old, is an adult, most of the important decisions are going to be made. The decision makers at the moment, the ones who have power to change, are not children. Children can speak to that power and challenge it, and we should be doing that too. But we can't just devolve responsibility in that soapy-shouldered way to say, "Oh, isn't it great that they're up doing this?" We need to use that to motivate us to go, "Well, what am I doing?"
Thank you. Any other additions to that from the panel? Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question then. There's a couple of questions about the pandemic, around how it's affected the economy, how it's affected people, but also are there any upsides to the pandemic? That's a question you have to answer very carefully, I've discovered.
I mean, what I would say to that is, there was lots of talk in the early lockdowns about, nature recovering and emissions dropping. The reality is that if we think about the emissions that are in the atmosphere, it's a bit like filling up a bathtub. So every year we're adding more water. Because of the pandemic and the global shutdown, we added about 7% less water last year, but we still added the other 93%. So in terms of benefits from the pandemic, in terms of climate change, it's really pretty small. But I would say, the thing that the pandemic has shown us is that when governments are sufficiently motivated, they can act. We've been told as climate activists, for decades, that what we want is naive and unfeasible, and we can't have system-wide change that quickly. And that's, what we've seen in the pandemic has just shown that that's simply not true. Impossible is not a fact; it's an attitude. So there is that benefit. The other thing perhaps is that maybe we've decided that we're not tired of experts, that maybe this has reinstated the voice of science and health professionals, and we need to use that opportunity to speak about climate change. But I think what's sad is when you hear people saying, "Oh gosh, well, what we don't want to do is have to live like the pandemic forever." And actually, a sustainable society is the opposite of what we've seen in lockdown. We're talking about more time with your friends and family, more time outside. not kind of being shut in a box on your own. And that's had a terrible impact. You know, the population that I work with, I have so many people who've been locked in tiny, manky little bed sits for, you know, nearly 9 months with no TV, no computer access. You know, and the mental health impact of that is appalling. So, you know, I think it's really, really important to be clear that what we want, the changes that we want for a sustainable world, and don't look like lockdown. So yeah, because otherwise that, you know, people just kind of go, well, I don't want that forever. Of course we don't.
Thank you. I'm going to give Nick and Magali a few minutes, but I'm going to cut you off if you talk too long, on what is GOSH doing. I think it's important that we do try and answer that question, or at least signpost it to people today. But I'm going to promise to come back to the one person who put their name on the question in Slido with a nice political one to finish with. So make sure you leave time for that.
So, hi everyone. So I think it's really laid out the scale of the challenge, scale of the opportunity, I suppose, in terms of dealing with it. But what are we doing as an organisation? Well, we're working on a number of levels. We're hoping to work on a number of levels and continue that going. So we've, as an organisation, we've made a commitment. We've acknowledged this reality, basically what has been talked about. We've called it a climate and health emergency. It's been acknowledged, and we've linked that into a couple of binding commitments to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions that are associated with our functioning to net zero by 2030 for those that we can control, and net zero by 2040 for those that we have an influence over. So that's a lot of our supply chain choices and decisions, working with supply chain, working with central NHS, etc. And our 2030 targets are all our building energy, all of our waste, our water, our fleet, etc. So there are very tangible commitments there. But now it's doing it. Mark talked about greenwash, and this isn't greenwash, certainly from the perspective of the people doing it. But of course, we now need to deliver this. We also have a platform and an opportunity to work with our peers. Imagine if the NHS really runs with this. You have a massive opportunity to impact and then spread out into the wider society in a hugely positive way. Actually, it could be quite empowering for the NHS at the same time, which we could all do with. So I think there's a huge opportunity to do that, to build our confidence as an organisation, which is already happening, to start to speak out about these things and make those links to health. As individuals, we've got our green champions, working groups that you can all be involved in, get involved in those. They are part of solving all of the different aspects of our greenhouse emissions. So we've got a session on the 30th of this month around that. We're working with our young people, Young Persons Forum, to be held to account, but also to get their ideas as well. So that's a balance. It's intricate and complicated, as was talked about here, but we hope to get that balance right, working with them. And we're at the beginning of a voyage, and it will go well beyond our walls. So, you know, we have a huge opportunity. That's quite general what I've given you, but there is a lot of specific detail underneath that which I can give you as well. Magali, any thoughts?
Yeah, sure, thank you. So I guess what really interests me is the fact I read that 80% of our health is shaped by our neighbourhoods or our urban environments, which is in fact outside of our hospital walls. So I've been working on creating a healthier and more child-friendly and sustainable environment around the hospital. And that includes looking at travel. We've been all working together on travel, safe and sustainable travel, air quality and pollution and transit. And essentially making a vision for, you know, increasing the paved surfaces around the hospital so they're more porous, introducing plants and trees, reducing the use of cars and providing cleaner air. Because in a sense, I don't think there's much point treating children with, say, respiratory illnesses in GOSH if they're stepping right onto a road which is often over the World Health Organization air quality limits. So I think there's a huge amount of potential that we can all be working on together in terms of the spaces around our buildings and cities. That's another tangent or arm that we're working on together.
Thanks, Magali. I'm just going to ask the last question, and I think I just reinforce what Nick said. You know, we expect the youth, as in the YPF, etc., to hold us to account. We've set some targets if we're not achieving them or we're not actually doing something about it. If you think we're greenwashing this, you should hold all three of us, anybody in sustainability and the entire executive board, to account. Just call it as you see it. But as Prathiban, and I apologize because I'm almost certainly pronounced that incorrectly, is the only person to have put their name to a question. I think it's absolutely wrong that we don't give that at least the 2 minutes we have left. We are voting for increasingly authoritarian regimes and governments with revolving links with polluting corporations. Do people care? How can we change this? Days, you stood for the Conservative Party, I presume. You didn't mention, but I presume that's who you stood for. How can we improve that?
I think that it has to come to political education, because I know, at least I can talk from my own experience. Politics was something that was offered when you were 16. And by this point, you kind of had already like doled off, or politics wasn't core. And I think a lot of people don't know how democracy is meant to work, hence why we're allowing systems like the ones we're living in to pretend that it's a democracy. So I do think that young people have to be politically literate and also know how to be involved, and not just by voting, but by becoming the candidates, becoming the decision makers. And I think that's a really important step to take towards changing from the kind of authoritarian governments that we're starting to see emerge and have already emerged. There is also the fact that we should consider starting to figure out what principles guide our society. And I think this is, especially when we talk about regenerative cultures, we should focus on how we can put love and care and duty at the heart of everything we do and every action we take. And when we start doing this, especially when it comes to things like policy decisions, people won't be disadvantaged. There will no longer be the marginalized people, and we'll love and respect everyone and create decisions that basically echo those kind of principles. And I think this can happen, but we just need people to recognize that this is a toxic system we're living in and there are ways out.
Okay, well, I think that is the perfect phrase to end on. It's 2:00, and I'm sure I'll get in trouble if I let things run over. Thank you to all of our panel. Days, I'll definitely vote for you, even though I don't normally vote Tory, but on this occasion I will if you stand again. Thank you for Hayley for telling us how bad it is, but telling us how we can have hope, and trying to explain to us how we can take our responsibility as the people who've caused this, and put ourselves in the front line, or have some discomfort in our lives, so the children who we are caring for as a paediatric hospital have a better prospect than they otherwise would have. So thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming. I am going to call the meeting closed. I will say, please contact us in sustainability, email us directly. We didn't answer all of the questions. If there's any way we can answer the questions post this talk, we will do our best to do so. Thank you, everybody.